Judicial prerogative. Eminent domain is of a judicial prerogative. The ascertainment of what constitutes just compensation for property taken in eminent domain cases is a judicial prerogative. And PD 76, which fixes payment on the basis of the assessment by the assessor or by the declared valuation of the owner, is unconstitutional. The case of EPSA versus Dulay. PD 1533 and PD 42, insofar as they sanction executive determination of just compensation in eminent domain cases, are unconstitutional. From the case of Panes versus Visayas State College of Agriculture. Another presidential decree, PD 1670, which authorizes the city assessor to fix the value of the property, is also unconstitutional. From the case of Belen versus Court of Appeals, this declaration of unconstitutionality may be given retroactive effect. In Republic versus CA, ang Republic is Department of Agrarian Reform. It was held that under RA 6657 or the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law, the decision of the provincial adjudicator need not be appealed to the DARAB before resort may be made to the RTC. The RTC, as a special agrarian court, is given original and exclusive jurisdiction over two categories of cases, namely 1. All petitions for the determination of just compensation to landowners, and 2. The prosecution of all criminal offenses under RA 6657. The need to appoint commissioners. In Manila Electric Cooperative versus Pineda, the Supreme Court held that in an expropriation case where the principal issue is the determination of the amount of just compensation, a trial before the commissioners is indispensable in order to give the parties the opportunity to present evidence on the issue of just compensation. Trial with the aid of commissioners is a substantial right that may not be done away with capriciously or for no reason at all. While commissioners are to be appointed by the court for the determination of compensation, the latter is not bound by the commissioner's findings, the case of Republic versus Santos. However, the court may substitute its own estimate of the value of the property only for valid reasons. So when are those instances, or what are the reasons with which the court may substitute its own estimate or judgment when it comes to just compensation? A. The commissioners have applied illegal principles to the evidence submitted to them. B. They have disregarded a clear preponderance of evidence. Or C. Where the amount allowed is either grossly inadequate or excessive. From the case of National Power Corporation versus De La Cruz, 2007. But trial by commissioners is not mandatory in agrarian reform cases because Section 58 of RA 6657 provides that the appointment of a commissioner or commissioners is discretionary on part of the Special Agrarian Court or SAC or upon the instance of one of the parties. Thus, the modality provided in Rule 67 of the Rules of Court on the appointment of 3 commissioners is not compulsory on the Special Agrarian Court. The case of Edmund Lee and Helen Huang versus Land Bank of the Philippines, 2008. What is the form of compensation for eminent domain? Compensation is to be paid in money and no other. But in Association of Small Landowners versus Secretary of Agrarian Reform, it was held that in agrarian reform, payment is allowed to be made partly in bonds because under the CARP, Agrarian Reform Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, we do not deal with the traditional exercise of power of eminent domain. We deal with a revolutionary kind of expropriation. However, in Land Bank versus Court of Appeals, the court declared that as explicitly provided in Section 16E, RA 6657, the deposit of compensation must be in cash or in land bank bonds, not in any other form, and certainly not in a trust account. While the association ruling allowed a deviation in the traditional mode of payment other than cash, this did not dispense with the settled rule that there must be payment of just compensation before title to the expropriated property is transferred. Thus, in the resolution on the motion for reconsideration 258 SCRA 404, the court said that upon payment by the landowner of the corresponding payment or in case of rejection or no response from the landowner upon the deposit of an accessible bank designated by the DAR in compensation in cash or in land bank bonds in accordance with this act. The DAR shall take immediate possession of the land and shall request the proper Register of Deeds to issue a transfer certificate of title in the name of the Republic of the Philippines. The provision is very clear and unambiguous, foreclosing any doubt as to allow an expanded construction which would include the opening of trust accounts within the coverage of the term deposit. Withdrawal of deposit by rejecting landowner. In the same resolution on the motion for reconsideration, in the case of Land Bank versus Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court also allowed the withdrawal by the rejecting owner of the money deposited in trust pending the determination of the valuation of the property. By rejecting and disputing the valuation of the DAR, the landowner is merely exercising his right to seek just compensation. If we are to affirm the withholding of the release of the offered compensation despite depriving the owner of the possession and use of his property, we are in effect penalizing the latter for simply exercising a right. Without prompt payment, compensation cannot be considered just, for the property owner is made to suffer the consequences of being immediately deprived of his land while being able to wait for a decade or more before actually receiving the amount necessary to cope with his loss. To allow the taking of the landowner's properties and in the meantime leave them empty-handed by withholding payment of just compensation while the government speculates on whether or not it will pursue expropriation, or worse, for the government to subsequently decide to abandon the property and return it to the landowner when it has already been rendered useless by force majeure, is undoubtedly an oppressive exercise of eminent domain that must never be sanctioned.